Thank you, Jan. I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are on, Musqueam land, and invoke the wisdom of elders, past and present, to assist our deliberations and comments and discussion today. It is rare in one's life that you have the opportunity to walk and speak on land that you were ignorant of before. I began teaching in British Columbia at Semiahmoo Secondary School in 1974. Some of my students were Semiahmoo, from the Semiahmoo Reserve. I fished in the Nickel River and was relatively unaware of what I was doing. I just drove through the Okanagan last week for the first time in 30 some odd years, where I taught at a very, very strangely named secondary school called Pleasant Valley Senior Secondary School, yes, which sits next to the Spalumcheen and Enderby Reserves. And I had the opportunity again to teach Spalumcheen children, young men, young women, from 1976 to 1978, and was again relatively naive of what I was doing. I think part of the subtext that Jan began to inform you about today, and I'm here principally because of that arm twisting. I was very reluctant not to speak with my colleague Jean Phillip or John Lester, who Professor Archibald was just visiting in Newcastle, who were co-authors of this report, because of the issues around the politics of identity. So the subtext I'll begin with about a speaking position I think is important, because that period that I was teaching in the 1970s, I was a young, critical, non-white, anti-racist educator, totally out of touch with the indigenous place, language, and people that I was working with. And I think that, if you consider that for a second, about the question about being allies, and the questions around coalitions for social justice, and the hierarchies of oppression and the blind spots that almost become impediments to forward movement within the academy and within education systems, that to me has been a point of reflection. So I think the subtext for me, partly because I'm retired, which is cool, and in British Columbia, which is interesting, it's beautiful here. They're finally putting left turn lanes on 5th and 4th and Alma, which I never thought would occur. And I've actually crossed Boundary Road and come from Burnaby, my home, to this strange place, Vancouver. So because I'm on that kind of a journey, I guess the subtext for the last few years of this work has been coming to know the self and coming to know how to engage as an ally with Indigenous colleagues, as friends and colleagues, in common cause. In an intercultural environment that is hegemonic, racist, and just reeling from everything from resource development to treaty issues to what constitutes Crown land to formal apologies from government. We don't know why this occurs in our lives, you know, and I guess when you're young, you read European novels and you kind of never really understand these intergenerational narratives. Partly because this Western education system is so much of a system, as David Olson argued around the literacy research, about moving from narrative to expository explanations of yourself, that it more or less thrashes narrative out of you. It thrashes your relationship to your own place and kin out of you, to the point where you become a talking APA head. And I think part of the process of knowing and engaging with land, with place, with spirit, and with Indigenous, knowing what you can't know as well. That process is one of unlearning as well. And so that reflection has been a road that I've been on for the better part of the last 5 to 7 years. You wonder why this happens. When I arrived in Australia in 1984, fresh off the boat from Simon Fraser, they really didn't know what to do with me, so they placed me in the Aboriginal and Islander Teacher Education Program. I was the first non-white on faculty at the time, and I sat there looking at the students, and it was, I guess, you became a Frarian very quickly, because I remember sitting there with my first cohort of 14 students, and I knew the Gospel according to Frere. I had my PhD thesis under my arm, and And I looked at them. We had dialect interference. They quite literally didn't know what I was saying, because Australian English doesn't quite translate that readily. And they became the first generation of PhDs, of lawyers. Koiki Mabo, whose court case was the first indigenous land claim, the Mabo case. I guess I have the badge of honor in that he failed to complete my Introduction to Language Arts course. I think he had better things to do. So that experience was life-changing. When I think back upon it, my mother, my grandparents on my mother's side left Guangzhou in 1895 and immigrated to Oahu. And anybody who's going to Whipsy, if you go drive the northern road around the north shore of Oahu, you'll go past a place called Punaluu, which is my family's village. And my grandfather had a rice paddy at the base of a place called Sacred Falls. On my father's side, my family came from Guangzhou in 1905 to Seattle. And you're welcome to visit the Wing Luke, a cousin related, the Wing Luke Asian American Museum there. It seems like I moved from Simon Fraser and Vancouver to a place called Townsville, which is actually a very strange name to give a place, Townsville. And it was named actually after Robert Towns, who was yet another lieutenant on the good ship Endeavour. Vancouver to Towns. So it seems like no matter who we are, here I am, a thrice removed Chinese, diasporic, Canadian, Australian, whatever. No matter how, quote, hybrid, Ryuko, or whatever you want to call it, we become, it seems like this history of colonization follows us around the Asia Pacific. I wound up teaching at James Cook University, coming from Vancouver, from Simon Fraser's place. And yesterday, this morning, I was running past the Maritime Museum and looking at the faces of British mariners and colonizers and, whatever. And I wound up in this obscure convict colony down south, working with the indigenous people. So I think, you could say it's karma or it's something else or something very odd or some kind of history that binds us together as all being post-colonial subjects in this part of the world in one form or the other. This particular study came to me at the end of my academic work. I was finishing up my last contract at Queensland University of Technology, and I was approached by the indigenous school reformer, Dr. Chris Sara, who I had known for 20 years. He had been a student and also been a principal of a very successful Aboriginal principal a very successful Aboriginal principal in a community, a mission school called Cherbourg. We have a mission residential history in Australia as well, much as you do here. And Chris approached me and said, we're going to do this major school reform. Let's go talk to the Prime Minister's office. So we went to Terry Moran, who had been my boss when I was in Education Queensland, and we visited Kevin Rudd's office. And they wanted to initiate basically about a $50 million succession of school reform activities. But they needed hard empirical evaluations in a good neoliberal policy environment that demands numbers. As my Indigenous colleague Will Davis said to me, he said, well, you didn't find anything in this study that we didn't know, mate. But you got numbers and you got a PhD in front of your name, so it's cool. So in fact, what we really did, we really were given the task, both by the indigenous community and by government, of constructing a multiracial, transnational, whatever, all of those trans and multi words, team to begin. And we spent the last 4 to 5 years of my life looking empirically and hermeneutically. And I'm good with numbers now. I went back to more or less after having struggled at Simon Fraser with Phil Winnie on my quantitative stats course, getting a C minus. The 3 years that I was in Singapore, I spent a lot of time working with multi-level modelers and sociometricians and economists and others, and realized that the power of numbers, that it isn't just an evil neoliberal project, but in fact there's a lot of power there. and that the quantitative and statistical people and the multi-level modelers are hopeless and lost without theory and without hermeneutics. So both Peter Freebody and I have done a lot of work that has tried to span qualitative and quantitative work after being a hardcore Marxist for the better part of much of my early work. So I'll take you through the policy issues that we have in the context is this. There are 640,000 indigenous people in Australia out of a population of 21 million. I'm going to be speaking in China shortly. And whenever you go to China, you give a lot of numbers. I don't know whether it's intercultural or whatever, but people really like to get their head around what kind of scale you're describing. So I will here. There are 20 million Australians and 640,000 indigenous people, of whom 160,000 are school-age kids. The median age of indigenous Australia is 21.4 years versus white Australia, and I'll refer to it as white Australia because in spite of the presence of 1.5 million or 2 million Asians, it more or less is still white Australia, as you'll see from our figures. We're looking at the median age of white Australia being about 37 years old, aging population like Germany, Canada, elsewhere, but of indigenous Australia, 21 years old. Isn't that interesting? So we've actually got quite a different demographic spread. About a quarter of the indigenous student bodies are in the large state of New South Wales, and about a quarter in the state of Queensland, where I live and work. The debate that you'll see that we've been having is very much, and I am working as an academic mentor to Indigenous and East Asian staff at Workland School of Education at Calgary, who paid for my air ticket, and I should thank. And the debates you'll hear are very similar. There is a broad debate between those who, we have a closing the gap policy like you do, with 15% less indigenous retention and about a 9 to 12 point test score spread, percentage test score spread depending on the age and the particular instrument that you're looking at. And the debates very much are split, both within the indigenous community and within policymakers, between what I'd call a culturalization argument that says this really is still a genocidal project extending from residential schools or from mission schools, and we need to change the subject of schooling now. We need to change what's taught and how it's taught, etc. And those who say, particularly within the indigenous community, my colleague Martin Nakata, my friend Noel Pearson, the indigenous activist, who say, leave the culture business to us, and would you please just teach them to read? Comparable to Elisa Delpet kind of other people's children. Martin Nakata, who was my student, who became the first Torres Strait Islanders, and we have two indigenous communities, Aborigines on the mainland and Torres Strait Islanders on the archipelago on the northeast part of Australia, just south of Papua New Guinea. My colleague Martin Nakata said to me when he was working on his PhD, oh yeah, culturalization. Well, you want the schools to teach us basket weaving? Great. Well, you're messing around with our future in the stock market? I want some of that action, dude. Okay, that was Martin's line, quite simply, at the time. And so we've got a split, both within theory and within practice, between what we would call, and in this study, as you'll see, we've used a lot of Nancy Fraser's work, between a push towards redistributive social justice. Social justice ain't social justice. There are different kinds of it, as Fraser's work in Justice Interruptus, her 1997 book, described. But in Fraser's terms, there's a split between those who argue that it's a question of recognition, of recognition, of rethinking, of representation, of the politics of representation, of changing what's taught in schools. And there are those who say this is about redistributing white man's goods. It's redistributing test scores, jobs, providing meaningful pathways to work, etc. And we have members of the Aboriginal community who are arguing both and. And you'll see these issues come up again. We've got a cultural strengths model, and this has been, I noticed Terry McCarty and Dr. Lee have retaken the culturally appropriate pedagogy model at AERA this year and are calling it a cultural strengths model. But we've got an argument for this versus an argument for, well, quite literally, DISTAR, direct instruction models, phonics, back to the basics models, etc. Okay? Behaviorist approaches to giving kids basic skills so that they can access the mainstream curriculum and succeed better. Another issue that we take on in our report is the relationship between the doublet that we call, Jim Ladwig and I published a paper in this, called the doublet between improved attendance and improved performance. Governments and ministers, and as Jan said, I've worked with these folks for a while, they always love to talk about closing the gap on attendance and closing the gap in achievement. Well, when you actually do multi-level analysis on the relationship between attendance and achievement, you find that there often is there is no empirical relationship between them. And in fact, counterintuitively, in many cases when your attendance goes up, your achievement goes down, and conventional measures. So I'll come to that as we move through some of the data. There are arguments about the limits of conventional testing, of course, and as Noel Pearson has argued, and I like this about Noel's work, we often as you'll see, well, I'll put it this way, whole community mobilization has to be a goal of government as against just providing health care this year and so forth. I've written several pieces and worked with Noel on several pieces using Bourdieu to argue that what happens in indigenous communities is governments provide dysfunctional combinations of capital and then blame communities when they can't mobilize them. So one year they'll give you health care, a new hospital, but they'll cut back on the social welfare of the policing. And the next year they'll give you reading recovery, but they'll forget to do anything about Otennis media and the health issues around hearing. And they'll give you social welfare, but they'll leave out private enterprise and setting the conditions for productive work and genuine labor and so forth. So I think that when you work in government, and I spent 2 years of my life as a ministerial advisor and as Deputy Director General, what you find is this is no accident. Because in Victoria, when healthcare goes to bid against education, we don't show each other what we're doing because we're actually arguing for separate cuts of the provincial or the state budget. So the discoordination of the provision of forms of capital to communities is actually built into the Commonwealth budgeting process. Okay. Now, in the time that I've been in Australia, we've seen this, and I call Indigenous pedagogy an issue a case of historical amnesia. Reformers come and go, sometimes speaking and sometimes not. And what happens is because principals and school reform and ministers run in cycles of 3 to 8 years, the same stuff gets rolled out in communities in 8 to 10 year cycles. Elders sit there and say, haven't we seen this one before? Because quite literally the staff turnover, the principal turnover, and ministers and governments every 4 to 5 years like to roll out a new glossy approach. So I've had somebody approach me recently and said, you know, we've just figured it out. Indigenous people in the Torres Strait are second language and dialect speakers. We're going to take migrant ESL, get it out there, functional communicative, and we're going to solve the problem. And I'll say, doh. 15 years ago you did this, 25 years ago you did this. Do you see what I mean? So it becomes a process of magic bullets and reform being rolled out. And I've seen this thrown at it, just given phonics. We actually saw in the Northern Territory in 1980s a very strong push on cultural circles led by elders, Freirean models, empowerment models, transformative critical pedagogy models. Well, that lasted about 5 years, principally run by white radical pedagogy people, and that faded away in the community. We saw a big push in the 1980s to adopt Gloria Ladson-Billings' warm demanders, communicative style approaches, etc., into culturally appropriate. This term is from the late, great Mandawe Yupingu, an indigenous educator. Ganma is the Yongle term for where salt water meets fresh water in an estuary. So the metaphor here for that pedagogy is cultural exchange, not culturally appropriate pedagogy. One of the critiques we had of Kamehameha Early Learning Project initiated by Kathleen Au, etc., with Native Hawaiian kids was that it was just a better way to teach conventional reading comprehension, but there was no cultural exchange going on. So what we find, we had Courtney Kasdan with us in Calgary last week. If you go back to Susan U. Phillips, 1972, Warm Springs Children Participation Structures, the very first study in the Warm Springs Reserve in Oregon of face-to-face eye contact, okay, 1972. So we have this prototypical argument. If we just change the communication protocols, the turn-taking structures, to match indigenous community norms, we'll get better achievement. Well, that doesn't fix the problem of the recognitive social justice and what they're actually being taught. So what Yopingu was arguing was to change both the school and the exchange and that it should be a genuine cultural exchange. We've had this through Connie Kelder and Ian Melkin's work in WA, very, very good work. And one of our colleagues, Tyson Yungaporta, is talking about indigenous learning styles again, as it was 20 years ago again, and pushing an 8 ways pedagogy. We've had this pushed as well using systemic functional linguistics. Lee Gunderson would know this work. Concentrated language encounters, directly scaffolded models of genre in which kids get explicit, again, in a Bernsteinian sense, explicit access to how the codes of what Jim Martin called secret English work. So we've thrown, and at present, the national curriculum, until Tony Abbott and our conservative government overthrows it in the next 18 months, the national curriculum has mandated that every teacher should be embedding indigenous knowledge in the mainstream curriculum. Now I'm going to show you some data on that to suggest that that might be a disaster, even if it isn't wiped out. But that's another question. So the point that I'm making is we've thrown everything but the kitchen sink at indigenous education over a 20-year period. And this is particularly important because we tend to treat educational research and this reform as a synchronic phenomenon. And those of you who are 20-something or 30-something graduate students, indigenous and non-indigenous, or beginning researchers in this field, know the history of your field. Talk to Professor Archibald. Okay? Talk to the elders within the field. Because oftentimes you can just be running the same line that was run 15 years ago, and knowing that history and knowing the context is, I wanted to say, it just occurred to me that the turn for me came on this campus probably around '79 when I met Professor Verna Kirkness, who was at the time, I think, one of the first appointments here. Joanne, was she been? Yeah, and there was no such space as this. Okay. Anyway, that's what we did. So we took 60 schools. Now, I'm going to explain to you the principles of Chris's approach, the strong and smart approach. It's in a Routledge book that was his PhD thesis. But what we knew that this was an unprecedented opportunity because they were going to give us the individually tagged data on every kid in the system, indigenous and non-indigenous. So they were going to give us a huge amount of, in spite of FOI questions, and getting this kind of data out of governments is very difficult, particularly because it's politically volatile information. So we knew we were going to get this huge empirical database as well as studying the reform of the schools. We thought, well, reforms come and go. Let's throw everything but the kitchen sink at this design since we're going to have the first sets of empirical data. Now, partly the empiricism, the lack of empirical data on indigenous achievement, pedagogy, etc., was because of the political sensitivities, but also because our field, I would not profess to be an expert in indigenous education. I'm a literacy and sociology guy. That's most of my work has been there. I don't do this. I'm only doing this because I've been invited in to do it. But the part of the issue here was, as Jan said, I taught for about 10 years in an Aboriginal and Islander teacher education program, and then I withdrew because of an indigenization process that simply said, it's our time now. And anybody with any sense knew it was our time to move out. So I don't profess this field. This is not my area of expertise, okay? Just like I think it's real hard and I get really ticked off when people who aren't Chinese American start writing about my community, okay? The politics of speech and who can do what and who can write what, with whom permission, whose permission, at what time you become strategic allies. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't heard Jan speak in Calgary about the necessity historically at this moment for strategic allies, because it just isn't my place to speak on these things, okay? So I think this, I mean, again, you look at a 30-year period, and so this kind of thing, it just, you begin making these choices and it weaves in and out of your work depending upon who is asking you to work with, to work on what political coalitions at what periods. There's our team. Well, I thought it was the dream team, but you know, it was the most difficult. Indigenous, non-Indigenous, white Australians. Our international reference team had had Russell Bishop, a Maori researcher who's been spoken at UBC, many others. Malia Villegas from the National Council of Tribes, and AllanLuke woman joined us. But I have to say, dream team or no, and I saw Michelle, I think I saw Joanne last when we were just starting this. I can't, this presentation of truth and research as if it is seamless is a big lie, because this is the most traumatic, difficult thing I've ever been involved in. The indigenous, non-indigenous, white, non-white arguments, male, female arguments, qualitative, quantitative. There was blood all over the place. Okay? Every meeting, sometimes I would dread going to work, and I think Gene Phillips and I talked about having post-traumatic stress because of the amount of tension that we had to deal with in terms of the intercultural forging of this research, the trade-offs that were made, the blind spots that people had, people leaving the room, turning their back on each other, refusing to work together. This was about the most difficult thing that I've ever had to deal with. So let's not, two things that I wanted to deal with, and I think I've dealt with one of them, is one, the first is the question of the necessity of epistemological and cultural self-reflexivity in any research that we do. Men, women, transgender, gay, whatever, okay? You can't write yourself out of the picture. It's always in play. It's in play right now as I speak. No question, okay? And it's embodied. It's not just who I was trained by and the fact that I'm a behaviorist and you're a Piagetian, okay? It's in my body. My color has given me certain keys and certain access to indigenous, bits of indigenous community that others don't have. But it also, I know what I've come to learn, to quote a Rumsfeldian quote, I've come to know what I don't know and respect it as well. Okay? So that tension of working through epistemic standpoint without overriding what you're looking at. One of the problems with that, with some junctures of post-structuralist feminism, is the self-reflexivity actually made it that it was about the researcher totally, and the fact that there were people in the world that you were working with, etc., began to disappear from the thing. I don't want that to happen at the same time. So how we walk this line between self-reflexivity about our own history, our own people, our own parents, our own kin, etc., as we move with others, at the same time without letting that self-reflexivity override the social scientific obligation that we have to speak truths as best as we can from the paradigmatic bases that we have. Boy, what a problem. And then you bring everybody's embodied difference to the table. Ugh. You know? So this was difficult. This was ugly, okay? You'll find the report there. I'll leave these slides with you. You can circulate them. So we followed both all the standard Western protocols, and we had to deal with community protocols. The Australian Indigenous Studies Association has nationally agreed protocols for engaging with indigenous communities, etc., which put very strong constraints on who can say what to whom and who can question what. Okay? So we've had to follow all of those, and we had community protocols every time that we moved into an indigenous community, quite obviously, and so forth. Okay? Well, the Stronger, Smarter approach by Dr. Chris Sara goes something like this. It tells kids that you can be strong and smart at the same time. It's very much reminiscent of a kind of a Black Pride approach that we would have seen among, initially with Black Panthers and others in the United States. It stresses positive indigenous identity, and so in Stronger, Smarter schools, even with populations of non-indigenous kids, kids stand up and they say we can be strong and smart. Every day they do that. In one of the schools that we're still working in, Waterford West State School, the national anthem is sung in Yungabear. The population of the school is 20% indigenous, 20% refugee migrant, and about 60% low SES whites in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Brisbane. But it's a Stronger, Smarter school. The focus that Chris had as a principle that is put into Stronger, Smarter schools is to raise expectations under the classic work of Rosenshine and Rosenshine, Pygmalion in the classroom. It's almost axiomatic. We know that if you teach dumb, if you dumb the curriculum down and teach low, people will meet that level. So Chris's push was to raise expectations and also push positive identity, also to bring more and more indigenous faces into everything from the groundskeeping to the paraprofessional staff, to the administrative staff, right to the teaching staff and the administrative staff. To focus on community engagement and participation, we have no school boards, we have no indigenous-run schools in Australia. Everything is run at the provincial basis, and because we have no successful treaties and no successful, we have no local indigenous school boards or leadership built into the system. Okay, shocking? True. Okay, so these were the 4 pillars with some degree of neoliberal school, local school staffing flexibility, etc. These were the pillars of the reform. And what happens is Chris uses almost a gestaltic, this was very controversial for us, and I really had issues with it, but he almost uses, you've seen that black eyes, brown eyes approach? He uses a consciousness-raising, anti-racist workshop where white and indigenous, but principally white Australian educators, are taken away on retreat for 4 days in which they play act and they watch psychodrama almost, talking about their feelings about race, about deficit, etc. His aim is to break the back of deficit discourse, to create an anti-racistness consciousness raising using gestaltic type techniques. It's fraught with contradictions and fraught with issues. Okay? And the government was putting $16 million behind it. Okay? Real issues. I mean, one of the things, no, I don't want to talk about this on tape. We'll talk about this later. Okay? So, but Chris, because he knew that history as a principal, and he's a damn good educator, Chris argued about pedagogy, I'm going to stay agnostic. Because he had seen that bandwagon over 2 decades that I'd shown you roll out. And so his view was very much, quote, one size doesn't fit all. When you read our report, empirically, my point was one size don't fit all, but that don't mean that no size fits nothing. Because in my work, and empirically, I think in the work we did in Singapore, we could demonstrate that you could reform anything that you wanted, but if it did not affect face-to-face interactional relationships between teachers and students, relations, as you said. And that's the core of Russell Bishop's work at University of Waikato with Maori, which is it's about the relationships. Okay? It's about social relationships, interactional linguistic relationships, symbolic relationships, turn-taking relationships, face-to-face relationships, embodied relationships. You got it? It's there. Russell's point and our premise, which made us a bit of a problem for Chris in this reform, was that unless you actually intervene, everything in every literature that we saw told us that unless you actually change what goes on with teachers and students, it doesn't make much difference. Okay? So Chris deliberately was avoiding the pedagogy curriculum debate. Okay, there's our data sets. 201 schools, stronger, smarter, plus control group. So we set up a matched pair, socioeconomic and racially similar group, and demographically, geographically similar group. In Australia, about 70%, the majority of Aboriginal and Islander children are educated as minorities in urban and suburban and regional city schools. Is that similar here? So about 30% of Indigenous kids are situated in remote outback, we call them outback or bush schools, small remote community schools where they constitute a majority of the student body. The majority of those 160,000 students constitute less than 12 to 15% of urban and suburban schools. Everybody see that profile there? Okay? So to assume that we're dealing with rural remote is not the case empirically. We had 525 interviews. We surveyed those people, and we did field observations in 13 schools. In addition to this, what I didn't put is we had all of the empirical data on test achievement, on attendance for every one of the kids in the 201 schools. And we also had all of the Indigenous, non-Indigenous empirical data on school achievement and attendance for every kid in every state except New South Wales, which for political reasons, we think political reasons, but they said FOI reasons, blocked us access. Okay? There's our workforce, and I'll start going through some findings right now. The first myth is that these were inexperienced teachers. Well, first of all, it is a predominantly monolingual English workforce that is teaching Indigenous kids. Full stop. Okay? we have a large variation. We've got this large standard deviation in our teacher age and experience level because we've got baby boomers hanging on, constituting about 40% and dropping of the workforce. And then we've got these younger teachers, these cohorts of younger teachers coming through. Okay? This was interesting. About only a third of the sample reported that they had any specialized pre or in-service courses in Indigenous education. That probably makes sense given the demographics of the population, because we've had mandated for, in most university pre-service courses for the last decade, one subject or course in Indigenous education. Sometimes that gets buried, and I'm sure in your faculties you'll have this debate. It gets buried in, diversity, multiculturalism, indigeneity, special ed, and everybody else who isn't that. Well, the fact is that's everybody, or that's most people. So it can both be appropriated within this general umbrella of diversity and social justice, but we now have a situation where we're getting, where most of these universities would have a mandatory Indigenous studies course. Whether it makes a difference or not, we'll come to in a second. Okay, I've got some interesting findings on that. Okay, Jean Phillips, who you met, who came to UBC a little while ago, and her mother actually went out into communities, and John Lester, and collected data directly. We partitioned off from all the white researchers the community data. Again, another political move and epistemic move on our part. But the interesting thing was, as here, you can't just, there's no homogeneity within being Indigenous, so you can't just send an Indigenous person out to a community because it's an Indigenous community, because you have place, site, generation, age, gender issues as well. In Jean's case, it was quite interesting because she went with her mother, and we actually got multi-generational women's stories right across the particular communities. Okay, well, big surprise. The Indigenous community in interviews and in data consistently told us that the deficit model was intact, was alive and well. Okay? So we also got from teachers, and this is Jean's work, it's brilliant work, we asked teachers, what would you advise new teachers? Now, the interesting thing here is we have something in survey data design called social desirability phenomenon. And social desirability bias occurs. It's called the Bradley effect by Americans. When they asked everybody, when Tom Bradley, black man, was running for governor of California, they asked everybody whether they would vote, who they would vote for. And Bradley won on all the polls, and then he got the pants beat off him in the election. And they called that social desirability bias. So if you ask most Australian-trained teachers, what do you think about Indigenous communities? They give you a politically correct answer. Partly because they knew who we were. They knew we were from the government. We were, you know, kind of left of center, critical folks. So we had to figure out a way, and this is how to be tricky with surveys. We had to figure out a way. So we asked them, what would you advise new teachers coming to your community? And then we ran in vivo, but we hand-coded hundreds of responses. And what we found is 45% of them tended to say things like this. Isn't that interesting? Nice research design if you guys want to, if anybody here is interested in taking it up. So you give them an open-ended, what would you advise a new teacher coming to your community? And this is what we got from about 45% of them, which is attribution of the problem to the kid, the family, the community, the culture, the language, alcoholism, fetal alcohol syndrome, drugs, whatever, you name it. They came up with it, okay? Low self-esteem, I love that one. Low self-esteem, okay? The universal explanation of anything. Must be low self-esteem. So the interesting thing that you come back to is this. 15% said some of the problems in our school are from schooling and from the system. About 12% said community governance, and look at this. Less than 10% named pedagogy and curriculum as the issues that they would advise a new teacher on. Now, that reminded me very much of a famous study called Education and Social Control, 1978, Anthony Green and Rachel Sharp, a study of British primary students published on Routledge. And in the Green and Sharp study, what Rachel did, was they interviewed British primary teachers when they started teaching and then 4 years down the line. And guess what? When a lesson didn't work when they started, they blamed themselves. After 3 years of staff room socialization, it was dumb kids. It was the kid. So this externalization of blame seems to be endemic to professional talk. But you can see what we've got here, which is, according to Jean's coding and the work that we did in this, an institutionalization of deficit discourse, really, okay, in classroom talk. Interesting discourse analysis work you could do with this as well. Occasionally, of course, we had teachers that said, hey, it's about, I've got to see the world differently. And again, I preface my comments today by talking about how little I knew in 1972 and 76 when I was teaching indigenous kids. You know, and I was a progressive and a Freirean, and I had my Dewey and my Freire. But still, the lack of engagement that I had with community, with the kids' cultural resources was profound. So this isn't, I think one of the things that our study begins to reveal is that part of the problem here is not evil white racists. It may be progressives. It may be critical educators. It may be social justice advocates. It may be teachers unionists, okay, with such a high percentage responding this way. I think we can almost one-dimensionalize, like I was speaking about this and Lynn Daniels said, but there was racism, and yes, I'm going to report that in our data. There were instances of just overt white racism and conflict in the school. But a lot of it, a lot of the problem, I think, is embedded in the kind of discourse assumptions or the plausibility structures of people who, like you and me, who would profess to be anti-racist. Foucault, savoir and connaissance, knowing how and knowing that. Everybody knows that we're supposed to be cool on this. But the pedagogical toolkit that people have for making a difference is very limited. And that's one of the things that I think our data will show us. Okay? We found that the deficit mentality extended to indigenous people who were in staff. Okay? So two things that we found pretty interesting is a lot of the indigenous teachers said they don't just think deficit of the school kids, they think deficit of us. And my job as an indigenous teacher in this school is to handle behavior management problems when they come to the office, not to teach. Okay? You got a problem? So and that's another finding we have. And the community members knew when they were being bullshitted. They termed it at one point, they described us a scenario where they were called in to sign off on a policy by a principal at the end of the year. And they called it sandwiches and meeting, you know, where they knew that they had no substantive input into the school policy on behavior or on this or indigenous community curriculum, but that there was a ersatz consulting process that required elders be brought into the school at some juncture. Okay? And then, of course, and this is almost so unremarkable in the literature, I'll just lay it on the table, that the kids just told us, hey, I was just trying to help my cousin with her math homework, and you accused me of misbehaving. Okay, I was looking away because I was trying to show respect. We use the Bourdieu's term misrecognition. There appeared to be a tremendous amount of misrecognition of kid behavior that the kids reported. Okay? This is the tokenism that was reported to us. Okay? Well, we'll put that activity in once a term, and you can do it. Okay? And then there were kids just giving us stories like this. The interesting thing, and plenty of them, so the intergenerational kin relations, the extended family relations were brought into the school. They were misrecognized consistently by the teachers. Okay. Now, but finally, we saw, obviously, communities want a range of things. They don't just want test scores. This was very interesting. We had kids tell us in one community that when the white teachers went to teach indigenous content, that it led to racist discussion that the white teachers couldn't control or participated in themselves. Okay? And when remember my prefatory comments about how difficult this is for me, okay? if you take a white teacher who's had no course training and no indigenous contact and no community contact, and you mandate that they will embed indigenous knowledge, good luck. Okay? In fact, one of the problems that the indigenous kids reported is that the teacher would show the movie Samson and Delilah, which is a very powerful movie, award-winning Australian movie about kids living leaving community and going to Alice Springs and living on the street. Very powerful movie. What happened was that led to racist catcalling, and the kids said they became the objects of study. That's what happened in Canada with first wave multiculturalism. Oh, it's multicultural day, bring your food to school. Like, do I want to be an object of curriculum? Okay? That's supposed to be empowering? Okay? So this reversal of subject-object teaching-taught relationships is one of the very subtle things that happens with the embedding of indigenous knowledge by non-indigenous teachers when they're indigenous kids in the classroom. Very complex, epistemically and interactionally. Okay. Now, this was pretty interesting. We didn't know, again, we wanted to find out how much the teachers knew and how engaged they were, the 90% white teachers population, et cetera, with the community. Well, you don't ask them, what do you think about Aboriginal peoples? Because they'll give you the textbook or the Time magazine answer. So what we did was we came up, again, clever survey making. John Lester. We worked on this, Joanne. It was very funny. We called this, when's the last time have you been out to dinner with an Aboriginal person? So we worked for hours on this, days on this one. Please indicate the frequency with which, and again, good Skinnerian, we wanted to know about behaviors, not views, because we knew we'd get PC views. So we said, in the last 6 months, okay. Of course, good statisticians, we had to scale the results because several people lived with Aboriginal partners and had dinner with them 6,000 times in the last 6 months, okay? So we had to scale the results, but here's the findings. I'm going to get some water. Have a look. Again, graduate students, a very easy study to do. Okay? And you have the protocol to do it because principally non-indigenous teachers responding. But look at that. Well, I don't want to do the John Kerry and use the A word, but we're living in an apartheid state. Indigenous people didn't have citizenship or personhood until the 1960s in Australia. And here are the results. Okay? There's still two worlds going on here. Outside of school, met with a parent or caregiver, 25%. Very, very little intercultural contact. Now, does it make a difference? We then took, later, we took the same data and we found that the people with higher self-reported knowledge and the higher contact were more likely to try to make a difference with the curriculum in the classroom. Okay? You don't touch stuff you're scared of or you don't know anything about or you don't have the discourse resources or, I mean, what would Schulman call this? Pedagogical content knowledge? Let's call it indigenous pedagogical content knowledge. You just don't have it. So you don't touch it, okay? But the interesting thing, and it didn't come up on this slide, but this had engagement had a statistically more powerful effect on the likelihood they would attempt to change the classroom than knowledge. Okay? So that is, playing footy with somebody or hanging out in the pub with them with indigenous mates, it's Australia, so, you know, with friends, seemed to have a stronger impact than taking a university course. Slightly, but it was statistically significant, okay? Isn't that interesting as well? So intercultural contact, face-to-face, hanging out, eating, living, seems to have more of an impact than studying a book, reading another book, okay? Interesting, okay? Again, I take key finding 20 with a grain of salt because every study has blamed everything on pre-service teacher education forever. Half of them, people don't go to class, don't remember what they did, but when in doubt, you blame it on your pre-service training. When in doubt, so every survey that we have when we ask people about pre-service training, because I've had my own students say, well, they never taught us about how to teach literacy, and I just say, you weren't there, mate. So I think this is just an issue, okay? So you can see how simple some of these sub-studies are, and remember my colleague Will Davis's comment of, once you get the numbers, people pay a little bit more attention. They don't write you off as being an ideologue, because you can actually show with some sample size, etc. Now, we did find that Chris's program could change the school structural hiring procedures, some of the school's ceremonial pro formas. It could change the school elements of the school ethos. In the school reform literature, we'd call it school ethos. But what we also found following the teacher surveys on the pathways of reform is that there were three distinctive pathways, and I'll try to show them. One is around pedagogy, one is around community engagement, and one is around governance, okay? So, and indigenous knowledge, okay? So I'll show you the three pathways. This is what we call a path analysis, and it shows the statistical likelihood that somebody who says, teacher A, says, well, we tried to change school climate by introducing indigenous cultural knowledge and then improving engagement. Another cluster said, well, we tried to change the school by focusing on governance and then involving the community. And another cluster said, we tried to promote upping the game in the pedagogy, and then we called it enacting the high expectations. But notice, statistically, this is teacher self-report on survey, the three pathways don't cross. That was interesting to us. That was totally out of left field. Sometimes the data does come in, and no matter how critical or hermeneutic you are, you just can't explain it. So what we thrashed around with this data again and again, and we found that there were three distinctive pathways to reform that the schools apparently were taking. And they had struggled to do them at the same time. Now, you know how when you're a dean or a head of department or a principal, you come in and they say, fix the master's degree, fix the undergraduate teacher ed, and by the way, you better do something for staff and this and that, and you say, hold on, term one, I'm going to do this, because I can't chew gum and walk down the street all at once. Well, these principals following Chris's program seem to be either focusing on this changing the pedagogy, upping the ante in the classroom, high expectations in the classroom, and what we called this following Fraser, redistributive justice. Some of them seem to focus on bringing more indigenous voice, power, decision-making into the school. We called that representation. And some of them really were focusing on the cultural knowledge and the embedding of indigenous knowledge in the curriculum, and we called that recognition, politics of recognition, recognitive social justice. So we're using this from Nancy Fraser. One of the members of the team, Courtney Kasdan, has written an article about this that tries to distinguish it. And we start to see these as three different pathways. Now, when I get to the end of the presentation, you're going to see the few schools, and I'll give away the punchline, the few schools that made a difference actually did all three. Okay? But most of the schools were only seemingly, according to the teachers, pursuing one of these at a time, or would emphasize one at a time. And that, again, was empirically interesting to us. Okay, so again, we get this distinction. This is just an elaboration on what I've been speaking about at several junctures, between redistribution of mainstream cultural capital. I'm using Fraser and Bourdieu in that sense. And this recognitive justice, or this changing the selective traditions of the curriculum, of what's taught to kids, etc. And again, we find advocates of both, okay? I'd like to think you can do both, but that's part of the issue that we can discuss afterwards. Okay, so we get classrooms that were actually bifurcated. This is one classroom that I went into. I was the observer on this. 12 kids, local community on a beautiful tropical island. Great place to do field work. And this is the way the lesson went. Okay? Freudian consciousness raising kind of a class. And then, this was about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and it was clear. Black pride, black history. We were in the classroom next to adjacent to the cane fields where people had been more or less worked as slaves, their grandparents and in many cases their parents. And then boom, you know what we saw next? Test preparation on how to do a multiple choice test in the maths to get ready for the state exams. So again, I mean, you know, Courtney and I have written from Singapore about weaving and oscillation in pedagogy. This wasn't a weave. This was like the car just kind of went like that, the bodies flew all over, and it just shifted. So again, how do you do both? How do you do both? How do you segue, or how do you transition, or how do you create a classroom that makes sense, that both supplies basic skills in the context of a political consciousness raising activity? We didn't see much evidence of anybody really see. But when you think about it, in pre-service education, do you teach people how to do both? No, because the two camps don't talk to each other, and you get this in this methods course, and you get this in your critical course, and they just don't ever explain how you might do both. So what do? I'll do my 15 minutes of consciousness raising and my 15 minutes of phonics. Okay? Interesting pedagogical problem. This is a different approach for a classroom. Again, predominantly indigenous, about 70%, in a small remote town. And they were going Lisa Del Pet. Give them the phonics, give them the skills, drum them in. And the relevance here, so the Salisbury sight words are like the Dolch list for reading of the magic 100 words. Skill and drill. Centrelink is the government welfare agency. So they were trying to make it relevant to everyday life by having the kids learn words from the forms on the social welfare agency. Okay? See, you don't need to make ideological comment on this stuff. You just show it, show and tell, okay? So, but the pedagogy, we had self-reportive pedagogy, and this was, for us, the key. Remember I said that Chris treated it as a one size doesn't fit all, so in stronger, smarter schools, we won't tell people how to teach, okay? The union likes that. Everybody likes that because it gives them professional freedom. Well, we found, and we tried to come up with self-report survey instruments and then triangulated with classroom visits, classroom observations, because in Singapore and in the previous Queensland studies, we actually were able to do hundreds of classroom coding observations. We couldn't afford it for this one, so we actually had self-report and then checking with qualitative observations later. And we found, again, contrary to the national press, this was not Foxfire, Dewey, A.S. Neal, Freirean, hippie critical education going on out there. We couldn't find any of it, in fact. And because, you know, I do critical literacy, everybody was saying, oh, come on, put on items on critical literacy. Let's find out who's doing critical literacy. Nobody was doing critical literacy with these kids. What they were doing, and I'm being agnostic. You know, you don't go into these studies pushing your own barrel. But really, it was basic skills. By any description, it was direct instruction in basic skills leading to vocational education. Full stop. Okay? Now, the interesting thing about this, what we said to government is, hey, you can't go back to the basics. You're there. That's in Courtney's terms, that's the default model of pedagogy in these schools, is when in doubt, skill, drill, worksheet. And stick with it, okay? And then discipline them when they get out of control. So this was low. We couldn't find much Matthew Arnold or Lord of the Flies. We couldn't find much project work or, you know, canoe building or repairing boat engines or auto shop. We couldn't find much of that. Nope. 4 resources model. Nope. They weren't doing that. Okay? Now, so that was the first part of the picture. And I'll show you one interesting empirical slide here. Is that quantitatively we were able to show that when there were key thresholds, and this too was new knowledge, as soon as it hit 15%, your numbers, your school population hit 15%, you went back to the basics with a vengeance. Now isn't that interesting? I didn't know whether to laugh or cry at this, because what that means is that if you had 13% or 10% of indigenous kids in your class, in your school, there was no difference between you and the white school in pedagogy. So there was no adjustment. As soon as it hit 15%, you tended to go basic skills, basic skills, basic skills. Is that? So the default models here, similar with this. ICSIA is an overall socioeconomic indicator, an SES indicator. You push basic man. As soon as you hit, when you combine indigeneity with low SES, you get the basic skills and the behavior management and so forth. Okay? Because the other thing that we don't want to elude, that the data tends to bury, is there's a great success story here among particular parts of the indigenous community. There's a whole middle class, university-educated kids, etc., coming right up through the system who tend to get washed out by averaging and means on test scores and so forth. Okay? And the more experienced teachers reported less time on behavior management. Okay? So what this means for us is that, okay, I'll get to languages in just a second. What this means for us is that the default mode is this, is as soon as your numbers hit about 15%, you do basic skills and then you stream them into Voc Ed. And then they drop out at a higher rate. Okay? It's a pretty simple story. Okay, so, and I know your government here is pushing Voc Ed and skills training right now as yet another panacea. Okay, languages, I'll just go very briefly on this because there's virtually the data is so bad. It's frightening. One of the things that the closing the gap discourse does is it moves towards a de facto monolingualism. It says English is cultural capital, you're going to learn English. So we, again, this was the percentage out of 1,000 teachers, the percentage of teachers who could accurately name the indigenous language group of the kids that they were teaching. So very low level of awareness that these kids are multilingual. You know. Okay. So actually the only place where we've seen languages accommodated now is some degree of language revitalization brought in as a substitute for Japanese, Italian, or French, as a substitute for a language other than English. That's the only area where we're seeing movement. Okay. Assessment, I won't talk much, but the testing is driving everything in Australia now. So I think a lot of what we're seeing pedagogically, et cetera, are collateral effects of the test push. And finally, there was no statistically significant. This was very discouraging to us. We got on the phone, our data was so bad that we got on the phone to 60 to 70 schools and we checked it to make sure that the data the government was giving us. What this meant is this, and here's the explanation I want to give you. The testing does this. It's driving the principals to engage in because the principals are being told, get your test scores up, close the gap. So what they're doing is they're engaging in idiosyncratic consumer behavior. The principals. If you were an economist, what else would you predict? And what we've begun to see is we see School X buying Jolly Phonics and getting a phonics spike in year 3, but their reading comprehension and their math is in the toilet. School Y goes into culturally appropriate maths and puts all the PD money in there and gets a spike at year 5 and year 3 maths, but their literacy scores floor out. So what we're seeing is we saw, of almost 200 schools, we saw no systematic school-level closure of the gap. I think six schools out of 200 some odd. What we saw were idiosyncratic performance spikes generated by PD and product behavior. Pearson Education loves this. Okay? Because remember I said this is a field full of panaceas. You pressure the principals, tell them they're going to sink or swim on their test scores, they go out and they buy. And we have an unregulated consultants market of people running around with PhDs and not selling approaches. And so what we get is principals purchase because neoliberalism says the principal makes the decision on the PD, the state doesn't. The school makes the decision, idiosyncratic performance spike. Everything else stalls or doesn't move. So this whole neoliberal sensibility of we set the targets, we put the tests out there, we ask that they do it, we get out of the way and give them local capacity to do it, it doesn't work. Okay? There's no balance, to quote the PISA stuff, there's no balance between informed prescription and informed local decision making and informed autonomy. There's no balance. People are making very oddball decisions. So, there was no coherent pattern. Okay, so I'll go through another 2 minutes and then we'll just take some questions. Deficit thinking still there? You can change the staffing. You can change the school ethos. Okay, so we saw that. Despite these efforts, it really isn't. It's not generating conventional achievement. The system is locked into basic skill, streaming, and voc ed. There's an overall lack of school curriculum program coherence, and the principals are making odd decisions, unregulated decisions, in a market. So all this marketization stuff is making it more difficult, I think, for everybody. Okay? Overall knowledge is low. Okay. Now, we found about 4 to 6 schools that actually were working, and this was one of them. I called and had a long interview with him. He was an indigenous man from the local community. He realized that the issue was transitional bidialectal, and the kids were bilingual and bidialectal. They spoke Aboriginal English, etc. He went and got the materials. It was in the Central Desert, so it was a homogeneous community, 100% Aboriginal. He was from that community. He went out and he began to work to train 3 teachers to lead, and they used a transitional. This is the Kimberley's Creole. Torres Strait Creole is spelled C-R-E-O-L-E, and Kimberley Creole is spelled K-R-I-O-L. They began to work on bidialectal transitions that made kids metalinguistically aware of the transitions that they had to make in the use of articles, in verb conjugations, and so forth. Trained people, teachers teaching teachers. Okay? He did work with a textbook series called Walking Talking Texts, which was developed by Ian Malcolm, and tried to teach transitional bidialectalism. Simple. Indigenous leadership, change in pedagogy, focus on local community resources. He actually got consistent gains right across the board. Okay? So that was one. The second one was one, well, we were working in the school, and we have been for about 5 years. So this is a question of how many PhDs does it take to screw in a light bulb? Okay? But the school has had for 4 to 5 years a strong focus on indigenous culture, even though it's only 20% indigenous. There are public celebrations. There are 2 full-time workers. We worked as teacher aides in an after-school homework program. But also, we put in, Terry, this might be relevant to your work, an after-school digital arts program in which kids were doing iRemix. And I noticed British Columbia has an iRemix kind of an approach here with kids doing video production. I've got another paper that we've done that I can show you where we made movies with kids. So we both dealt with digital arts, and at the same time, the shift for this school actually was that through all of this work, the level of classroom talk and the intellectual demand began to rise over a 3 to 4 year period. We really we worked as teachers' aides, and I spent a day in this school every year for about 3 years. Every week for about 3 years. And then we realized after about 2.5 years that the problem was the dumbing down. And Brisbane was flooding one day, and I went in and I said, can I go for it, to the staff, to the principal, and she said, go for it. And I said, what are you guys teaching today? And they were doing Roald Dahl, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and the usual stuff. Phonics with 3 blind mice. And I said, look, the town's flooding. Up in the rich kids' school where my grandchildren are, they're doing meteorology, they're looking at the newspaper, they're doing water samples, they're doing the whole thing. What are you guys doing? So the dumbing down of the curriculum, something that many of us in the room have dealt with for many years, was very consistent in the school. So even though we were doing the after school and the digital arts, it was still dumbed down. Gradually over a 3 to 5 year cycle, and the test scores finally all went up. And the attendance went up and the community was happy. It was about a 5 year cycle of reform, but it took a lot of work. So we did have some success. that's pretty much the whole study. You'll find it online. There are 600 pages of it. Good luck. We will not be there, other than, there are a couple, if you go to my web, my e-prints, you'll find a couple of articles. We won't be publishing articles about it, okay, because we can't agree. We're fighting over everything still, okay? So so you have to get, there is a teacher's version of the report, so you have to read you have to get the teacher's version and get the, but I think it's pretty damn good work, so. Okay, thank you very much, and Jan, over to you.
I'm always so inspired when I hear Alan speak. I'm inspired to go out and purchase some Omega 3s for memory, because you can just reach back into studies from the 70s, 60s. I mean, it's quite impressive on all the range of scholarship and experiences that he's able to draw on. So I'll be picking some of those up.
Okay, good.
So we'd like to take some questions, though, from the audience here. So if there's things that you want to ask about in relationship to the methodology, some of the findings, and that might be related to your work and your research, please. Hendrik.
Dr. Luke, thanks for this excellent presentation. The last time you were here, I think maybe the last time you spoke at UBC, you talked about some of the complications of coming to the kinds of conclusions that you presented to us today. And the statement, which I love to quote to everybody I could find, was that teaching is feral. How much of that is playing through the work that you've done in this extended study?
You know, I think one of the things that we found is that I actually had to read the Shulman literature on teacher knowledge, Lee Shulman, because I think that teachers use their available discourse resources and their cultural resources that they bring to the table. And what this study is really about is it's about white teachers' resources that they're bringing to the table. Can I come back on the feral comment, which I know that, Hendrik, you've used? They fall into what Courtney Kasdan calls default modes. In classroom discourse, she uses the term default. And what we're finding here is white teachers, post-apology, post-reconciliation, probably in good heart and good faith, with very limited discourse resources from an educational establishment that actually is not giving them any concrete ways forward. We can give them all the social justice rhetoric, all the anti-racist rhetoric. We can change hearts and minds. But if we don't give them a versatile toolkit for actually working with kids that puts substance on that rhetoric, they stay at the level of knowing that and not knowing how. So I think there's a very practical in-service and pre-service question here about not just dealing with the literature and whiteness and becoming to know yourself, that's part of it, but also about what I'm going to do with these kids, okay? And so what happens is we sit in indigenous programs, in educational foundations, and we sit here and we hector people, but because we never colonize the mass methods course, because it always sits as a mention. Now they've got to embed indigenous knowledge. It's going to even get more chaotic out there. So I think at this point, can I change it, Hendrik? They're not feral. They're absolutely almost bereft. Lynn Daniels had reminded me, he said, but there are many races here. Yeah, some of these people are racist. Racism is there. You know, read any one of the number of people in this room on racism. You know, read the history of it, read Jackie Ottman, read Joanne. It's there. There's no question of it. But unless we give people practical tools for moving forward with these kids, they can be as anti-racist as we want them to be if they won't move forward. So I think that's the real challenge with this system. The other thing is, I'm a bit more of a centralist. One of the things that this neoliberal stuff has given us is there's actually a collusion sometimes between neoliberal state governance and the teachers' unions to protect teachers and school autonomy. Cut them loose and let them go. Don't tell them what to do. Well, I was Deputy Director General, and I've never felt more powerless than sitting on the 13th floor of government office trying to figure out how we get the feral population to move. Okay? This population
is basically having its own way, with principals buying whatever the hell they want to buy. And the kids, so when the schools, when the parents are saying, it depends on which school you go and it depends on whether you get Miss Smith or Miss Jones, they're absolutely right. The only coherence here is, if you're black, you're going to get phonics. And it's going to get dumbed down. That's the only data. So for us to lift that requires pre-service, but it also requires governments getting control of this PD money and actually making people make some better choices with it, and coming to some consensus on how we're going to move forward on this. Okay? Yes?
Stanley Knight, AllanLuke. Thank you. I'd like you to comment on Paul Pearson's use of Siegfried Engelmann as an approach to visit their school. I think that fits in with what you're saying.
Yeah, very good question. Our colleague Noel Pearson, who I've worked with for years, who is an Aboriginal lawyer, activist, and brilliant political operator, Noel is working with the Cape York communities on the north part. The country goes like this. It's the north part that sticks up here by Papua New Guinea. And in 3 or 4 communities that Noel has lived in and grew up in, he's actually made alliance with Siegfried Engelmann of Oregon to implement DISTAR and corrective reading program. Now, I know this program because I was trained at SFU in PDP on how to teach DISTAR, and I pulled my daughter out of DISTAR when she was in Armstrong Primary. So it is a direct instruction behaviorist model that has minute-by-minute monitoring of both teacher and student, in which you are giving, in our day we gave Smarties as rewards. Okay, that is a behavior.
Yes, it is.
Okay, the data shows, I've been asked to blow this out of the water by the unions and others because DISTAR is so controversial, and I've been very reluctant to do so. The data, when I look at DISTAR, and it's very hard to find effect studies. When I was on the board of Reading Research Quarterly, we debated on letting people who had commercial interests in these projects write up efficacy studies. So that rules out a whole bunch of studies of DISTAR. But when we get to it, like Slavin's programs, Success for All, what we find is that you can get some short-term gains in particular sub-skill and domains. And when I look at the data from Engelmann and the Cape York, and what I've told Noel is, I'll say, okay, Noel, you can do that for X number of hours a day, but A, that's not an education, that's not a curriculum, and what are you going to do next? So you can give kids direct instruction in phonics for 2 hours a day, every day, yada, yada, et cetera, but then what are you going to do? You know what I mean? After you get a slight gain in some year 3 test scores, initial reading, et cetera, then what are you going to do? When we look at the literature, there's a big debate about whether it, like reading recovery, has washout effects by year 6 and so forth. And Engelmann and like Murray Clay used to say, well, that's because they blow it after they come out of our program. Well, whatever. Okay? So the question of longitudinal effects in reading has been one which has been with us for many decades, as you would all know. But the question here for DISTAR, for Noel, is a direct instructions basic skills program is not an education. It's not a curriculum. It doesn't deal with political consciousness, with knowledge of the world, with geography, with space, with time, with self. It doesn't deal with any of those things. So that's the challenge, is instead of just kicking that as yet another panacea, you simply can, I think the best thing to do is to say, yes, you can do that, but it's not the whole enchilada. It's part of one. Is that?
And I was in prison, and I read some papers as well that I had teamed up with Siegfried Engelmann when I was a doctoral student at Oregon Beach, and so I was very interested in that.
Well, the other problem with DISTAR and programs like it is that DISTAR in particular, the cost can be almost 6 figures per kid.
Yeah.
And you're sending test materials and materials to, you know. So you'll find a paper that I've written, a short paper for the Teachers Union called On Direct Instruction, that reviews the literature and basically makes that point. Okay?
Thank you. Just quickly on.
Oh, excuse me. So the argument I made about DISTAR is that it's not a curriculum, and B, get this, good bureaucrat, it's cost ineffective.
What's the process? Facilities, you don't have any training offer on the facilities of the schools. Are there great differences in that?
No, money is not really a problem with Indigenous education. We have lots of money for schooling, lots of special funds, federal money, et cetera. Now, after the federal budget that came out yesterday, we might not. But at present, neither the principals nor the teachers described to us facility problems or money as being the principal problem. There were lots of pots of money, and also there was a lot of mining money, philanthropic money around that could be drawn upon for Indigenous education at the present moment. I'm not sure that in absolute terms money is an issue, although the quantums of money are variable because, as you know, in-service textbooks and pencils and computers cost more as you move in distance away from urban centers. So the same amount of money does not equal the same as the further away you get. So money was not really an issue. Any other questions? Tony?
I'm interested, Al, great presentation, thanks very much. But interested in the preparation of the principals. How do people become principals, and what training do they have for that, and what support do they have when they get into those positions? Because they seem to play a fairly key role.
Negligible. Overall staff, what they do is when you go to an Indigenous community, first of all, if you go into a suburban school with 15%, you get no specialized training at all. Okay? If you go into a rural and remote community with 97%, you'll get a 4-day induction delivered by the state government that'll have a little bit of consciousness rating and welcome to Indigenous Australia, mate. You know, I probably principally delivered by non-Indigenous people, I would suspect, in many cases. The actual training for principals, etc., is probably similar to you, which is they're good teachers, etc. They've gone up as curriculum consultants or as head teachers, etc. They're usually promoted forward. If you're lucky, they've got a master's in educational leadership from a university, which has given them their dose of Fullen and Hargraves, with due respect to the video. Okay? So they've gotten generic school reform, maybe neoliberal governance. If you're unlucky, maybe they got Lee Iacocca and dynamic leadership and 6 thinking hats, okay? But they've gotten not necessarily any specialized training on teaching and learning or on Indigenous. And again, if you look at the work of Vivienne Robinson in New Zealand, who did the meta-analysis of principal efficacy, what she found was that charismatic leadership does not lead to any change in conventional student results. Secondary schools are virtually impossible to mobilize anywhere. And her other finding is that in the elementary schools that mobilized, she calls for curriculum and pedagogically focused leadership, etc. So, I mean, I'm very much, you can see this data also suggests to us the main game is what goes on in the classroom. Both of those principals that we were working with in those successful schools were pedagogically focused leaders. Okay? Yes?
Thank you for your amazing presentation. I just was trying to look at the report. So could you just tell us where it is?
The report?
Yeah.
Yes, I'll give you the link. It's there. You'll find it on that ePrints. And it's interesting that the government accepted the report. We had a lot of moral support from the senior Indigenous academics and community elders. Then the government changed, and then the report's been buried. It's being ignored, and the whole country is pushing down direct instruction because Noel has the Prime Minister's ear, just as Chris had the Prime Minister's ear for that approach. I won't even begin to, because of I don't want to go on tape in this, but the degree to which, and I've spoken to Chris and Noel about this, but the degree to which governments who are bereft of what to do tend to look for heroic approaches as opposed to doing the hard yakka of school reform. It's just endemic in Australia. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, real quick.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I have a question about the test or the assessment that the government is using is determine the effective schools based on the achievement scores.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just wondering about what kind of tests students take, and are they culturally unbiased, what kind of skills?
Well, first of all, the tests are pretty average. The NAPLAN tests that are currently in place are in their second or third iteration. One of the reasonable things about the ETS instruments is if you want to put a good reading comprehension test together, an initial reading test, you should run it through a large number of items, through multiple iterations, through a decade. A lot of these tests are fairly hastily put together. The other problem with the test is that they have relatively small item banks compared to some of the more established testing instruments. In terms of cultural appropriateness, you'll find another report that we did for the Queensland government about 10 years ago on culturally appropriate assessment. And the interesting thing about it, in which Chris helped us, we did a review of both a year 2 diagnostic net and some of the early testing instruments that were emerging in Australia in the 90s. And obviously the semantic content of some of the basic items were urban and they were mainstream. There was no question about that. But if you do a literature review, what you'll find is that post-Shockley IQ debate, the literature on culturally appropriate assessment has fallen, has disappeared. It's almost disappeared. Okay, why? Because of the emergence of IRT, of item response theory. And what item response, so when you confront psychometricians and you just simply say, see that item there? That one sucks. That one, if you're from an indigenous kid from a remote community, you aren't even going to know that that's an animal because it's not indigenous to that area. We gave a year 1 reading test from the Australian an initial reading test from the Australian Educational Research Council, which had been adopted in the UK. Very obvious culturally appropriate items on how the term tart is a British term, Canadian one, butter tart. Well, in Australia, it only means one thing, and you don't eat it, okay? So you can do that, and you know what the psychometricians will tell you now? They'll simply say, here's the population data that shows that when we've trialed this item, it has no bias effect on the performance of indigenous versus non-indigenous. So IRT now, and the sophisticated kind of it's item response theory, the sophisticated kind of test development items actually allows them to weed out any item that might show a bias in male versus female, urban versus non-urban, etc. Now the interesting thing about it is that weeding process usually takes out anything of any substantive semantic or local value or content. So I think that we should reinitiate the debate on culturally appropriate assessment. Right now it's dead because the psychometricians have kind of end-run the whole debate. Okay? Thanks, Jan. Okay.